Can I use this bathroom? Okay. I'm wondering, I don't know that we're gonna have a class after Walter Metz isn't there. So. Might be late or Okay, so he's here.
Coincidentally, I don't know if you noticed, there was a movie which I had not seen before about, oh my goodness, the female, very prolific female director that we've been talking about. I'm trying to remember because I TiVoed it and I haven't watched it, but it was on TCM this week.
Is it about Dorothy Arzner?
No, is it Bletchley? What was it?
Oh, Alski Blaché?
Yes, Bletchley,
Yeah,
thank you.
right. Yeah, I went looking for a DVD of that. I've never seen it. So TCM is showing it now?
It showed it this week, and as I said, I TiVoed it. I don't know when they're showing it again, but
Yeah.
I haven't had a chance to watch it, but I thought, oh, wow, this is timely. And I
Right.
probably would have just gone right by it if we hadn't been talking about her.
Yeah. Yeah, TCM's nice. On Sunday nights, they show all kinds of silent cinema stuff.
Yes, they do. Mhm. And I was paying closer attention than I normally would.
That's good.
And I was curious about how you were going to tie all those 4 readings you sent
Uh-huh.
together.
Well,
'Cause
it's a
they-
magic trick.
Yes. Oh, and I know what I wanted to mention. I was flipping last weekend. And of course, they were showing horror movies over the weekend because it's Halloween month.
Right.
And we had been talking about the use of, oh, good grief, I hate having an old brain. Anyway, color
Mhm.
in movies. And they were showing The Vampire Bat, which surprisingly had Melvin Douglas in it. And I think it was Fay Wray.
Uh-huh.
And it was in black and white, except there was a scene where all the townspeople, kind of like in Frankenstein, were marching with their torches to kill this feeble-minded young man. And the only thing that was not in black and white were the torches were in orange and red. And I thought, whoa, I had never noticed anything like that before, where that was the only thing in color.
Right. It's surprising for a film made that late to be that dyed. So the torches themselves, but the rest of the image was still in black and white? Is
Yeah.
that right?
Mhm.
So that
It was
must
a
be,
neat effect, but it was like, whoa, how did they do that?
yeah, well, I'm not sure. The way it was done in the silent period is that it would be hand colored. So every frame would be hand colored.
But this was not silent.
Yeah, I didn't know that they would have hand colored a film that late. I guess one possibility is that they could have laid 2 layers of the image on top of each other. I'll have to look at it. I think I've seen that film. So when I teach, you know, the girl in the green dress in Schindler's List,
Mm,
there's a section of Schindler's List, which is almost all in black and white, where this little girl runs through the town. And she runs through the ghetto, and she is the only thing in color in the film. So that's all computer generated. But it's not unprecedented in the history of cinema for things to be colored.
I think it was
So-
like around 1932, maybe.
Yes, I just looked it up. It's 1933. So there are all kinds of mechanically reproducible color technologies in the late 20s. So every once in a while you see a film, particularly a experimental short that uses color. The first Hollywood feature is Becky Sharp. I think that's 1936. That's entirely in color. But I'm just trying to think how they would make part of the image without
Just
hand.
those torches.
Yeah, it must be hand tinted, but I don't know why they would spend money to do that. I'll have to look at it. Well, I think it might just be us. So I'm kind of interested in your responses to the films that we've been watching and the things that we've been reading. It's just the three of us, we can sort of chit chat more than usual.
I guess there's 1, 2, 3, 5 of us.
Oh, more people are arriving. Hi, Jim.
Walter, good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. I just got a message. The link that Jackie sent didn't work. I used an old one and that worked. Not sure what that means.
So that was me.
Yeah.
The Zoom link didn't work that she sent out today or yesterday.
Okay.
It took me to some weird Skype thing.
So I'm not getting those emails. What I can do is send the link out to the email addresses I have.
Yeah, I just went back to the original email you sent out.
Yeah, I went to an old one as well and that got me here, but that might be the problem with not many people here today.
Got it. Let me send out. So I just sent out the link to people. If you're in touch with people in alternative ways, just let them know. I can put the link in the chat as well.
The other thing I did, which I normally wouldn't do, is my sister's into documentaries and she still gets DVDs from Netflix in the mail. And she got a 2-parter on Woody Allen.
Oh,
And
made recently?
well, it was made in 2011, and I thought, I wonder if there have been any updates, but it was quite interesting, actually.
Yeah, that's kind of right on the cusp.
And they use the word, and not until our class had I really used the word, is it auteur?
Uh-huh.
Yes, and they used it for him, which of course makes sense now that I
Right.
understand the term.
Yeah, so
But his style it was all about how he, I guess, developed his style and how he directed and how he wrote. And they got into a little bit of his personal life, but not into not too
Right.
deeply.
well, that might be something worth unpacking. So let me show you. It's my lecture on the international art cinema. So the reading that I sent you is from B. Ruby Rich. That book's actually called Chick Flicks. And she analyzes this film from the 1980s, A Question of Silence. So in the 1950s, the Hollywood industry's control over its exhibition venues was clipped by a consent decree between the industry and the Supreme Court. And it separated production and distribution from exhibition. Up until that point, a Hollywood studio essentially had a vertically integrated monopoly, a so-called oligopoly, because it's a control of industry by a few companies rather than just one. But vertically integrated means you control the product from beginning to end in its creation. So what that meant is that whether the Hollywood studios movies were good or bad, the exhibitor needed to show them. And there was all kinds of nefarious techniques for doing that. Block booking, if you wanted a good film, you had to show bad films too. So the studio dumped everything to exhibitors. And so when the studios were forced to divest themselves of their exhibition holdings, it meant that exhibitors could show films not made in Hollywood. And so you have the rise of an independent cinema, most specifically in the United States, associated with John Cassavetes. And then there's a huge influx of films from around the world. The most famous influx is from Europe. So Ingmar Bergman films from Sweden, Fellini films from Italy, the French New Wave from France. So all this happens in the late 1950s because the so-called Paramount Consent Decree is signed in 1948, but it takes a long time for it to get fully implemented. So generally, as an economic history matter, as an institutional historical matter, we demarcate the so-called classical Hollywood cinema associated with the efficiently controlled studio system. From 1917, that's the moment when film style crystallizes. So Thomas Ince creates a studio in 1913. By 1917, all the Hollywood studios are in Los Angeles and are growing. Till 1960, a moment when the consent decree is fully implemented. And what we know about the stability of the industry is collapsing. So when historians sort of teach intro to film history, they generally show Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho from 1960. It's very different from the immediately previous Hitchcock films. Most importantly, North by Northwest. North by Northwest, 1959. Big budget film, Cary Grant, very successful. But at the same time, Hitchcock has a television show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents. And so he shoots Psycho on an incredibly low budget with his television crew. So it's in black and white, as opposed to North by Northwest, which is in color. Shot with a television crew. So if you've seen Psycho, at the end, the psychiatrist gives this explanation of what's wrong with Norman Bates. It's incredibly stilted in terms of its film style. So it doesn't have the energy or the panache of anything that you see in North by Northwest. So that's a pretty good transition moment between the classical Hollywood cinema and the so-called new Hollywood. Anyway, so there's an influx of these international films, and a lot of them are associated not with nations, but with individuals. So 8½ is Fellini, 1963. Through a Glass Darkly is Bergman. So there was a Swedish cinema from the birth of cinema forward. But if you ask me, hey, Walter, name 10 Swedish films, they would mostly be Bergman films. And so something about Bergman represented unto itself a way that cinema operated that was completely outside any other parameters that people had for understanding cinema. So it's not the studio, it's not the national tradition, it's Bergman. So in fact, the birth of American film studies is associated with Bergman. Foreign language departments, theater departments, literature departments in the 1960s began teaching art cinema because it wasn't uninteresting like Hollywood cinema from an artist's point of view. It was something else. That's why we call it the art cinema. And so, I don't know if you've ever seen a Bergman film. This is Through a Glass Darkly. I just choose it because it's about women, and it essentially mimics a very famous novella from the United States, Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. So it's a brother and sister talking with each other.
Alla väntar på honom som ska komma. Men ingen oroar sig. Och de säger att jag ska få vara med när det sker.
Varför gråter du för?
Men det är ingenting. Det är ingenting farligt. Jag får ibland en sån häftig längtan, förstår ni? Jag längtar efter det där ögonblicket. Dörren ska öppnas. Och alla ansikten ska vända sig mot honom som kommer.
Vem är det som kommer?
Ingen har sagt något bestämt. Jag tror att det är Gud som ska uppenbara sig för oss. Det är han som ska komma in till oss i rummet. Genom den där dörren. Minus, jag har en sak att tala om för dig som är väldigt svår.
Vadå?
Jag vänder mig bort från Martin. Han står där och ropar efter mig. Men jag kan inte hjälpa honom. Det blir bara ett spel.
Märker han något?
Jag vet inte säkert. Jag måste ju välja mellan honom och det andra. Jag har beslutat mig. Jag har offrat Martin.
Är det verklighet det där?
Jag vet inte. Jag står mitt emellan och ibland blir jag osäker. Jag vet att jag var...
So in this sequence, the sister is pressured by the room. Her grip on sanity is slipping away. And of course, that's the plot of The Yellow Wallpaper. In that, a housewife is stuck in her bed and she begins to imagine her wallpaper moving. And her husband, a doctor, insists that she's just hysterical. So these films in the 50s and 60s, the most famous Bergman film in the 60s is Persona, in which there's two famous Swedish actresses that may be playing the same character. And every year, Bergman produces a film that lots of people in the United States go to see. So if you imagine you're a European theater professor in the 1960s and you're teaching Ibsen and Strindberg, and then you see Bergman films, it's a natural leap to say, oh, this is a way that I can get my students engaged with perhaps what's not engaging about Strindberg. Because in many ways, Bergman is doing with the camera what Strindberg did on the stage, express some kind of Scandinavian pessimism about modernity. So there's this appearance of these art films in the United States that's relatively unprecedented among people that just kind of casually watch movies. And by the late 1960s, people in the United States, particularly New York-based film critics, are trying to grapple with what that means for the history of cinema. And Andrew Sarris, New York film critic, writes this book, The American Cinema. And he translates a term from the French New Wave critic, Francois Truffaut, from his essay, A Certain Tendency of the French Cinema, which is an article published in Cahiers du Cinéma, the most famous journal in the history of film studies. Edited by André Bazin, a philosopher who directed his attention to cinema. And Bazin was essentially the tutor of all the French New Wave filmmakers, Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard being the most famous of them. And what Truffaut argues in the Certain Tendency essay is that French studio filmmaking is stilted. It's all shot on sound stages like Hollywood, and it's all adapted from classical French novels. So the most famous film that he critiques is René Clément's Gervaise, which is an adaptation of an Émile Zola novel. And Truffaut says cinema should be personal. It should be about the filmmaker, not about a moribund literary tradition. And so these two films from 1959, Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless and Francois Truffaut's The 400 Blows, are deeply personal cinema. Truffaut's film is directly autobiographical. His star, Jean-Pierre Léaud, plays a version of himself. And there's actually 4 sequels to that film. So for example, Truffaut was a kind of reprobate as a teenager, and he stole typewriters, and there's a sequence in 400 Blows where the central character steals a typewriter as a kid. He gets sent to reform school. So Sarris reads that essay, and Truffaut in French calls it La politique des auteurs, the politics of authors. And Sarris translates that phrase as the auteur theory. And the auteur is a particular kind of filmmaker who is in command of a wide range of the film's meaning, which is unusual because films are made by so many people. It's not like writing a short story. At any given time on a high budget film, there are hundreds of people on the set. There's already been tremendous contributions by people in pre-production, the writing of the script, the director training the actors, location scouting, all kinds of people are involved. And then once the film is in the can, a Hollywood film goes through 18 months of post-production. Editors, post-production sound people. So when you add up who's the author of a film, the answer is usually hundreds of people. But what Truffaut and Sarris are arguing is there's particular directors where that's not the case, where the director takes control of the whole meaning of the film and directs everyone, not just the actors. And so what Sarris does is say it's not just these international art film geniuses like Bergman and Fellini. There are also people peppered through the history of Hollywood film that would have taken control over their films in the same way. And so Sarris organizes the American Cinema book around a Greek god metaphor. So the great auteurs of cinema are in the pantheon. And then there's lesser gods who took lesser control of things. So almost all the filmmakers I'm interested in are in the lesser categories. So Sirk, Douglas Sirk is down there. Max Ophüls is down there. And the folks that are up at the top, fully control of the film's meaning and whose style repeat film after film, John Ford. So you can tell a John Ford film because it's a Western that looks like a John Ford film. And then if you go watch a non-Western John Ford film, you can still tell it's a John Ford film. So John Ford's most famous non-Western is The Quiet Man, shot in Ireland. And if you watch The Searchers and The Quiet Man, despite the fact they're from two different genres, the film is using color similarly, it's using John Wayne similarly. And so there are these styles and thematic practices that repeat again and again. So that's what the auteur theory means. And it's pertinent to this class because not many women are deemed auteurs. First of all, there's only 2 women to choose from in the classical Hollywood cinema. And then the number of women who are allowed to direct a new Hollywood film is still fairly low. And so it'd be very difficult even to identify women filmmakers who would have built that kind of reputation and had that kind of control over the design of a film. So for Saris, he's looking backwards. Orson Welles is in the pantheon. There are no women on his list of, I don't know, 15 filmmakers. It's fully possible to go back and think about how Dorothy Arzner's films all correspond to a certain kind of way of looking at women. My friend Ken File writes about Arzner and talks about the lesbian aesthetic of her films. But the way in which Saris defines how an artist might be in control of the meaning of film leaves very little space for the work that we're doing in this class. So Woody Allen is an auteur in the Saris sense, that if you line up all his films, right, made essentially once a year since the late 1960s, you'll notice a bunch of things that recur. Most importantly for us is that they're all the Pygmalion myth. So there's always a guy, and he latches on to this woman and changes her. And so at the core of this class is Annie Hall. It's the film that if you said to me, I just have time to watch one Woody Allen film, show me the most characteristic one, that's the one I would show you. And so it's in this class because Tamara Jeffers McDonald writes a book about romantic comedy and has 5 chapters. There's a chapter about screwball comedy earlier, but the last of her chapters is about Annie Hall. And she makes this argument that Annie Hall is the most radical romantic comedy ever made. Generally, romantic comedies are boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. So that's the plot of the screwball comedies, Bringing Up Baby, right? They meet and hate each other. And then in the middle of the movie, they start to grow together, but then there's a fight. And then the climax results in the reunification of these 2 people that at the beginning of the film hated each other. So Bringing Up Baby, David just succumbs to Susan's chaos and doesn't care much about the Brontosaurus collapsing. But that's not what happens in Annie Hall. In Annie Hall, these 2 very different people are drawn to each other. I'll run through the clips, Anyone not seen Annie Hall?
Been a long time ago.
Yeah. So here's the Annie Hall clip run. Alvy Singer is this goofy guy who lives in New York. He's autobiographically Woody Allen. Woody Allen started his career working for Sid Caesar, writing jokes for Your Show of Shows. And all of those writers, except for Woody Allen, made the transition from New York to Los Angeles. So his friend Tony Roberts, we begin in a telephoto lens shot of Roberts and Allen on the streets of New York, and they walk towards us. The Tony Roberts character, his writing partner on this New York TV show, moves to Los Angeles to make sitcoms. And there's a funny sequence late in the film where Alvy, Woody Allen, goes to Los Angeles and gets sick at the making of the sitcom that his partner is writing. Anyway, early in the film, he meets Annie Hall, who's incredibly different from him. And most of the film's structural jokes are positioning the two as diametrical opposites. So that is essentially screwball comedy. There are more literal screwball comedies. So What's Up, Doc, for example, from the early 70s works this way. In that film, Bogdanovich is just attempting to remake Bringing Up Baby with Barbra Streisand. But Annie Hall is more subtle. And so it's using these devices about the oppositional nature of men and women under the rubric of Pygmalion, right? Pygmalion takes Galatea and molds her in his own image. And the idea is that there's this guy who knows things that bequeaths what he knows to this neophyte woman that he's in control of. So most famously, the Pygmalion myth from the ancient world is used by George Bernard Shaw in 1913 for the play Pygmalion. And that most famously becomes the source of My Fair Lady in the 1950s. So what Shaw does with the myth is turn it on its ear. So if you know the plot of the musical, at the end, Eliza tells Henry Higgins to go take a walk. And that's what Annie Hall is building towards. So in Annie Hall, Woody Allen takes the modernist critique of the romantic comedy that otherwise Hollywood endorses in the 1930s, in the 1970s, and gives it the so-called Shavian ending. All of which is important because if we know in retrospect what Woody Allen may be up to in real life, it strikes us as deeply contradictory to what the films are about. So what MacDonald suggests is that Annie Hall is a radical romantic comedy because it's about the displacement of the Pygmalion figure, not the power of the Pygmalion figure that in real life, it seems Woody Allen is being positioned as a predator, a pedophile. And there's a number of ways of getting at this. Annie Hall is the most common way. The way I like to get at it is through Another Woman, which is why I had you watch that film. Another Woman is Woody Allen's attempt to remake a Bergman film the second time. So right after Manhattan and Annie Hall, Woody Allen's sort of masterpieces of the late 70s, he attempts to make for the first time a film that's not a comedy, Interiors, 1979. And it's a brutal failure. It's a big budget film that makes no money. And so from that point onward, Woody Allen essentially alternates between making big grandiose films, films that are given big release by studio with big money in them and big stars. So Crimes and Misdemeanors, Hannah and Her Sisters, these are the big Woody Allen films of the 1980s. And he generally mixes them with small films, low budget, quiet fall releases. And I think Another Woman is the most elegant of those films. It's an adaptation of a Bergman film, Wild Strawberries from 1957. Wild Strawberries is about this professor who's retiring and is going to be feted by his former university. And it's told through interior narration. We hear him thinking, reflecting back on his life. And what Allen does with Another Woman is take the interrogation of the professor, played by Jenna Rollins, and swaps the gender. And that's the sort of quiet source of Another Woman. If you're interested in Woody Allen more broadly, the other film that takes the shards of Wild Strawberries that he doesn't use in Another Woman is Deconstructing Harry, where the Woody Allen character literally goes back to his alma mater to get an award. But Another Woman shaves off all the stuff about the masculinity of Bergman's ponderous Swedish existential drama, and strips to the bone what it's like for this Jenna Rollins character to have this self-awareness that the life that she thought she had was not interrogated enough. And so what's really weird is that if you ask me, so Tamara Jeffords McDonald says that Annie Hall's the most radical romantic comedy ever made. Walter, show a feminist film from the 1980s that anyone saw, and I would show Another Woman. And the reason this clashes with contemporary academia is that cancel culture wants to remove artists for good reasons. That I just showed a Bill Cosby stand-up film to my comedy class, and it's creepy as hell to watch. Bill Cosby himself. In Freudian terms, a lot of the jokes end up being read tangentiously now that we see some kind of anger below the surface that we never saw before. But Bill Cosby was never a gender radical. He may have been a race radical, but Woody Allen makes these films in which, against all tradition, even Bergman tradition, women take a central role. So I'll just work through some of the ways in which Annie Hall positions this duality. So there's two sequences that most people would talk about to show the way in which the first two acts of the film position Alvy and Annie as binary opposites. The first is the subtitle sequence.
Can I ask you, is this a sandwich?
Oh,
So she drives him home. This is the funniest line in the movie, I think. She's a terrible driver.
That's okay. We can walk to the curb from here. It's fine. You want your tennis stuff? Huh?
We could walk to the curb from here. I say that all the time when my kids park badly. So this is the first time they're alone together. They meet at the tennis club and they have this kind of awkward talk with each other as they're sort of feeling each other out in terms of who they are and how they relate to each other. And then Alan makes a joke about the International Art Cinema. He uses subtitles, but they're not subtitles to translate Swedish to English. They're subtitles to translate man talk to woman talk.
Oh.
God bless.
Well,
What?
yeah, I sort of dabble around, you know.
They're wonderful. You know, they have a quality.
Well, I would like to take a serious photography course. And
Photography is interesting because, you know, it's a new art form and a set of aesthetic criteria have not emerged yet.
aesthetic criteria, you mean whether it's a good photo or not?
The medium enters in as a condition of the art form itself.
Well, to me, I mean, it's all instinctive, you know. I mean, I just try to feel it, you know. I try to get a sense of it and not think about it so much.
Still, you need a set of aesthetic guidelines to put it in social perspective, I think.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess you must be sort of late, huh?
So you get the point there. There's all of the kinds of gestures that work like this. Another funny joke in the film is they both go to a psychiatrist. So he keeps taking her to Marcel Ophuls' The Sorrow and the Pity. It's a 4-hour-long documentary about the Holocaust. And the joke of the film is that at the end, after Annie has kicked Alvy to the curb, one of the great victories that he sees is that she's taking her new boyfriend to see The Sorrow and the Pity.
Fahrzeugen entfliehen.
That day in Brooklyn was the last day I remember really having a good
We
time.
never have any laughs anymore is the problem.
I've been moody and dissatisfied.
How often do you sleep together?
Do you have sex often?
Hardly ever, maybe 3 times a week.
Constantly, I'd say 3 times a week. Like the other night, I'll be.
All right, there's a sex joke for you. And then I think the pivot point in the film is there's a moment at which Alvy's pressure on Annie breaks. So they're in a bookstore and she's got these cat books. So, you know, these kind of coffee table books with cutesy pictures of cats. And he brings these books over and he says to her, I think you should read these books about existential philosophy instead of, you know, those cat books. And so this is the Pygmalion force of what Alvy wants to do to Annie. And by the end of the film, that she's realized that she doesn't need him. And the film ends with this incredible depiction of New York City that's built out of his loneliness. And it's incredibly complicated because he's written a play about the experience. And maybe one thing that would be useful to understand how Annie Hall works is that it begins and ends with a joke. The film begins with Alvy delivering a stand-up routine, telling a joke in front of a white background. And this is because Alan wrote the film in linear order. They tested it in front of an audience and audiences hated it. So Alan and Marshall Brickman rebuilt the script and said, what if we told it all in flashback? And that's one of the great achievements of Annie Hall. So imagine going back to Bringing Up Baby and ripping its parts apart and rearranging the sequences. That's essentially what Annie Hall is. And so by the time you get to the end of the film, you're working to reconstruct the timeline. And then Woody Allen is essentially not only the author of the film outside the film, but the author of the play inside the film. And so there's dual layers of narrative running at the same time. And then it has one of the most famous endings of all new Hollywood film that I would be remiss if I didn't make you watch.
Person, how can you choose this lifestyle?
What is so incredibly great about New York? It's a dying city. You read Death in Venice?
You didn't read Death in Venice till I gave it to you.
Well, you only give me books with the word death in the title.
It's an important issue.
Artie, you are totally incapable of enjoying life. You're like New York. You're an island.
Okay, if that's all that we've been through together means to you, I guess it's better if we just said goodbye, once and for all. You know, it's funny, after all the serious talks and passionate moments, that it ends here, in a health food restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. Goodbye, Sally.
Wait. I'm gonna go with you. I love you.
21 was my first play. You know, you're always trying to get things to come out perfect in art because it's real difficult in life. Interestingly, however, I did run into Annie again. It was on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. She had moved back to New York. She was living in Soho with some guy. And when I met her, she was, of all things, dragging him in to see The Sorrow and the Pity, which I counted as a personal triumph. And Annie and I, we had lunch sometime after that and just kicked around old times.
Just to have my arms around you. Still the thrill that it was the day I found you seems like old times, dinner dates with flowers, old times.
After that, it got pretty late and we both had to go, but it was great seeing Annie again. I realized what a terrific person she was and how much fun it was just knowing her. And I thought of that old joke, you know, this guy goes to a psychiatrist and says, "Doc, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken." And the doctor says, "Well, why don't you turn him in?" And the guy says, "I would, but I need the eggs." Well, I guess that's pretty much now how I feel about relationships. You know, they're totally irrational and crazy and absurd, but I guess we keep going through it because most of us need the eggs.
So in the play, inside the movie, he produces the romantic comedy ending. But in the film, he does not. Because it's real difficult in life. That's the name of my essay about Annie Hall. And so you get this two-shot of them. And in the logic of the romantic comedy, this is what you're supposed to want. Except we know that Alvy's a controlling ass. And so we like it when Annie escapes. The film includes this parody of a trailer, this kind of editing that assembles all the film really quickly. It's a lamentation because these are all the romantic moments in the film that we know are not going to happen. And then from inside the diner, we watch from a distance. It echoes the opening shot of the movie, but now the telephoto lens is going to demonstrate isolation. And in fact, humanity is replaced by the machinic. In the opening shot, it's the bustling streets of New York City full of people. And in the end shot of Annie Hall, it's just cars, no humans. And so the last image of a human we see is him in isolation and us isolated from him. And then he leaves the image and we're left with nothing but the blank void of modernity. It's an incredibly elegant film. I wouldn't want to live in a world as a film scholar without it, which is not a defense that Woody Allen might be a pedophile. But I would say that if we were going to use the criteria of what jerks people were, probably would lose about 90% of the artists in the history of the world. And I probably don't want that to happen. My feminism students, as you can imagine, vastly disagree with me. But I really like the contradiction. How can a guy that seems so awful in real life make such elegant movies? And the answer, because it's real difficult in life. And what artists do is attempt to transcend the world and sometimes succeed and sometimes fail. So I started this little digression trying to explain what auteur theory was. Woody Allen is one of the great auteurs of the New Hollywood. These films tend to cohere around a unified style. He doesn't leave New York City. He shoots with very small crews. He doesn't edit a lot. So the most efficient filmmakers working in Hollywood are Woody Allen and Clint Eastwood. They shoot incredibly low ratios. So a wasteful Hollywood film shoots a very high ratio. So Stanley Kubrick shot a really high ratio. Lots of footage filmed compared to how much footage will be in the final film. So the filmmaker who shot with the highest ratio in the history of cinema is Frederick Wiseman. So for those of you that took the Wiseman class, you know what this feels like. High school's 80 minutes long. He shot 40 hours of footage. That's an insane ratio. Woody Allen and Clint Eastwood shoot a 2 or 3 to 1 ratio. John Ford shot a 2 to 3 ratio. That is virtually what they call editing in the camera. I need this shot, let's get it, let's get out of here. And that's one of the ways Woody Allen was able to make those small films on the streets of New York City, which is very difficult, right? You have to close city streets down, you have to shoot at 4 a.m. It's usually very expensive. But Woody Allen's able to maintain a consistent style by shooting in this way. And then, of course, Woody Allen has emulated his filmmaking around Ingmar Bergman, I think essentially trying to invert the tragic nature of Bergman films into the comedies of Woody Allen films. But the source material of that is the virtual embodiment of auteurism in the United States. That when Andrew Sarris says there are these filmmakers in control of the meaning of their own films, there's no better example in the international art cinema than Ingmar Bergman. And the filmmaker who most achieves that in the New Hollywood cinema is Woody Allen. Even after all of this publicity, negative publicity, Amazon canceled his contract, and he's still making a movie right now, largely with French money. So that's what an auteur is. No matter what, I'm going to make films the same way. Now that might be insanity, but it is what the auteur theory is built around observing, that there are some filmmakers, no matter how the world turns against them, continue to make films. And in Sarris's book, the person that's like that is Orson Welles. Orson Welles made one film that is intact and coherent, if we consider Citizen Kane coherent. So he's the wunderkind from Broadway and radio from New York City, and he gets a 6-picture contract with RKO, and he moves right after the War of the Worlds in early 1939, and he wants to make Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So he works on this film for well over a year and can't get anything done. And so then he and Mankiewicz write Citizen Kane, and that film gets released in the middle of 1941. And Orson Welles is such a pain in the ass, he doesn't really ever finish another film again. He shoots Magnificent Ambersons, which is a brilliant film, but we can only know that by imagining from the shards that we have. Welles goes down to South America for FDR as part of the Good Neighbor policy, and RKO butchers the edit while he's gone. So we have this like very strange fragment of Magnificent Ambersons. Even in its fragmented form, it's astonishing. But all we can think of is, if Welles wouldn't have pissed off everyone in Hollywood, what film might it have looked like? If you don't know the story, here's a good example of Orson Welles pissing people off. William Randolph Hearst, that Citizen Kane parodies as Charles Foster Kane, is the most powerful newspaper person in the world. And the central conceit of Citizen Kane is nobody knows what Rosebud is. The Kane dies at the beginning of the movie and utters Rosebud. The film explains what it is, but everyone in Hollywood knows the joke, which is Hearst took a starlet, Princess Marion, and turned her into a star, even though she had no acting talent. And his nickname for her vagina was Rosebud. So you can imagine being one of the most powerful people in the United States, having your most intimate secrets blasted on a movie screen. Hearst theaters refused to show Citizen Kane. And indeed, these are the things you don't want to do against corporate capitalism. And so for the rest of his career, Orson Welles shot on low budgets around Europe. Some of the films quite brilliant, but made on less than $100,000. So I'm a Shakespeare and film scholar, so he made Chimes at Midnight, which is assembling all the Shakespeare plays about Falstaff. He made a Macbeth film that's quite good, an Othello film that's quite good. But these films don't look like Hollywood films because they didn't have the budget for him to make them as Hollywood films. And it's not like he didn't want the budget, it's that he couldn't raise the budget. Okay, so I've gotten sidetracked, but I hope that was interesting and illuminating. Let me try to do this. So we arrive with Annie Hall in the 1970s, and I run 2 stories next to each other, the story of film and the story of television. So let's start with the story of television. You have foundational sitcoms in the 1950s in which gender play is quite open. So I want you to see that as the equivalent of silent cinema, where Lois Weber and Alice Guy Blaché could be really important. And so if you take 50 sitcoms and put them next to each other, you sort of wouldn't even know that we live in a patriarchal culture. That Lucille Ball performing Vitamin de Vegemin, where she gets drunk, doing the TV ad for the snake oil tonic. And Ralph Cramden on The Honeymooners with the $99,000 answer. That's, I think, my favorite episode of a sitcom ever. Ralph's going to go on the Name That Tune, essentially. And he's memorized everything there is to know about popular music. And has anyone not seen that? Oh, yeah. Okay. That's from my comedy class. I don't want to spoil it. I'll show it to you. This is a different digression. This is my comedy class. So I Love Lucy and the Honeymooners, Bewitched and Gilligan's Island in the 60s, Mary Tyler Moore Show in the 70s. That's what I'll build to. The 50s sitcoms like I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners are so-called axial shows. They're built around a single character. Lucy wants to break into the show every single episode. Ralph Cramden always wants to make it big and not be a bus driver anymore. And this continues throughout the 50s and 60s. Father knows best. Mr. Anderson is in control of a family, but the show is called Father Knows Best. And if it's mistitled, it's because Mother Knows Best. By no means is it an ensemble. The kids don't have the same status as the parents in a domestic family sitcom. And so the shows that I'm interested in writing about from the 60s, Bewitched is an axial narrative. Samantha is the hero. She constantly has to save her dunderheaded husband because of her crazy relatives that threaten to expose him for being married to a person who is other. The genius of Bewitched is that the otherness of Samantha substitutes for a whole bunch of things. Liberated woman, African-American people. Gilligan's Island is a remarkable axial narrative, 7 characters in some kind of biblical sense, but Gilligan is who the show's named after. And in fact, Gilligan is what the American Studies scholar R.W. Lewis calls the American Adam. He's the only one who has pure of heart. The rest of the characters are always up to shenanigans, but Gilligan is not. Then all of the so-called barnyard sitcoms of the 60s, Beverly Hillbillies is the most popular show of the 1960s, are canceled. And they're canceled because advertisers discover they don't make any money if kids and people from rural areas without any money are watching the show. So they go after so-called quality audience demographics, which are people from the 20 to 50 year age range who live in cities. They're the ones in the United States with expendable income. And there's a set of 3 shows on CBS that produce quality demographics in the sitcom, MASH, All in the Family, and the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And in fact, at one point in the history of those shows, they were all on the same networks, CBS on Saturday night. The TV critic Gary Deeb calls that the greatest night in the history of television. And so what the Mary Tyler Moore Show does is invent a different kind of narrative, what we call an ensemble narrative. So in the newsroom of WJM, Mary and Mr. Grant and Murray and the Ted Knight guy and the Sue Ann Nivens, they're a family, but they're a workplace family. And essentially displaces the axial nature of the domestic family sitcom where father knows best. or Secretly Mother Knows Best, with a rudderless family. Mr. Grant seems to be the father, but even in the image, he's sent all the way to the left margins. The core of that show is Mary and her workplace family, and then the family that builds around Mary at home, Rhoda and Phyllis. That has tremendous impact on the nature of television narrative. The Mary Tyler Moore Show is produced by her husband, Grant Tinker, and they build a company, MTM Enterprises. With the money they make from the MTM show, they branch out into drama. The first transition is with the Mary Tyler Moore cast itself. Mr. Grant goes off to be an investigative journalist after running the station. That show, Lou Grant, is an hour-long drama. And then two of the most important dramas in the history of television, Hill Street Blues in the Cops franchise and St. Elsewhere in the Docs franchise. These shows are never well rated, but they last for 7 years each. St. Elsewhere, I don't think ever was more than 70th in the ratings. And you know, the lowest rated show was 110 or something. And the reason is the demographics of those shows was so quality, by which we mean people with expendable cash that spend it. And all of those shows do not have an axial narrative structure. There's a bunch of people and we follow their individual plot lines. The Cops franchise will never be the same. So I don't know what contemporary cop shows you watch. My wife watches Chicago PD. Without Hill Street Blues, there is no contemporary cop show. And then without St. Elsewhere, there is no contemporary hospital show. And of course, the history of television from St. Elsewhere onward is there's always been a highly rated, successful show about a hospital. So St. Elsewhere, ER, Chicago Hope, and Grey's Anatomy, which essentially has been running since I was born or something, right? But they're all ensemble-based narratives. And this has tremendous impact in gender studies, that once you get rid of Father Knows Best, you're left with Mary, who has two families, none of whom are genetically related to her. What Mary Tyler Moore and Grant Tinker wanted to do was have the Mary Tyler Moore Show be about a divorcee, and the CBS standards and practices didn't allow that to happen. And so they made up this thing that she was just out of a long-term relationship and moved back to Minneapolis. Okay. That's the connection with what the history of sitcom has to do with chick flicks. But here's the $99,000 answer. So Ed, Ralph's friend, plays the piano. And throughout the episode, Ralph is getting ready to go on the game show. And he's literally memorized everything there is to know about popular music. So Ed sits down, cracks his knuckles, and plays Swanee River. And Ralph is like, stop playing that. Play this music. And so he studies everything. And then he gets onto the game show and experiences the classic comeuppance. You know, I'll just get you a little bit lead in to what happens when he gets on television.
Ralph. How you woke up my wife?
Yes. I realize that I cannot talk to Ralph because he is stubborn and unreasonable. But I have always had great respect for your sense of fair play, and so I appeal to you. It is late. People would like to go to sleep. I think you should stop playing the piano. And I am sure that you will agree with me, Ed, because you have always been fair and considerate. You are a reasonable man.
Don't let us soft soap you. Don't let us soft soap you. You're just as unreasonable as I am. Go ahead and play.
If you touch that piano again, I'll lose all my respect for you.
Go ahead and play, Norton, if you don't want to lose my friendship. Oh, I'm on the spot. If I play the piano, I lose your respect. If I don't play, I lose your friendship. Why, oh, why was I blessed with this musical talent? I don't care for this.
All right. So this is ancient Greek tragedy, right? He enters the game show with tremendous hubris and suffers an Oedipal fall.
And if you answer that, the next one is worth $12,375. Now then, we keep rolling along and doubling the money until finally you get to the $99,000 answer. Now, you can stop anytime you feel like it and take what money you've won up to that point. Now, is that all clear, Mr. Cramden?
It certainly is, and if I may, I'd like to make a little statement.
Why, surely, go right ahead.
I intend to go straight on, forge ahead to the $99,000 answer.
I think it's only fair to point out to you, though, that you don't need to make that decision now. You can stop at any time you want to and take the money.
Well, I made up my mind, and I thought you might as well know it, and I know it, and they know it, and everybody.
I see. Well, sir, tell me, have you discussed this at home? Have you talked it over with your wife?
Yes, I did, and regardless, I'm going for the $99,000.
I see. Well, that's quite a decision. I guess you really know your popular songs.
Well, I don't like to.
All right, Mr. Cramden, I wish you a lot of luck, and here's your first question for $100. Are you ready?
I certainly am.
All right, Mr. Cramden, for $100, who is the composer of Swanee River?
Swanee River.
That's right, Swanee River. Can we have a few bars of Swanee River, Jose?
Swanee River.
That's right. Now, who's the composer? Your time's running out. Hurry up. You better take a guess.
Ed Norton.
Terribly sorry, Mr. Cramden. No, the correct answer is Stephen Foster. But thanks so much. You've been a wonderful contestant and a swell sport. Goodbye, Mr. Cramden. Goodbye, Mr. Cramden. I'll be seeing you.
I'll be seeing you, Irving Kale and Sammy Fain, 1938.
Oh, Mr. Cramden, it's all over now.
It's all over now. Basie Simon, 1927.
Good night, Mr. Cramden.
Good night, good night. There were two songs, Good Night. It was Good Night, Irene, written by Lomax and Ledbetter. Good Night, Sweetheart, written by Rudy Valley and Ray Noble. Then there was another.
This way.
Please.
Please.
Please was sung by Ben Crosby and
So in the 1950s, you have these axial narratives, and notice that there's very little difference between that and Lucy trying to break into the show. So job switching, where they destroy the candy factory, Vitamita Vegemin, where she gets drunk on the snake oil that she's trying to sell on television. There's a deliberate echo in The Honeymooners of Vitamina Vegemin when Ralph goes on to try to sell his kitchen gadget. And the big distinction in the sitcom is between that and this kind of workplace family ethos of the 1970s. And I would just want you to track the distinction between the development of the sitcom and the development of cinema. So you've got Annie Hall in 1977, and the next moment is Backlash. So there's two films that win the Best Picture, 1979 and 1980, Kramer versus Kramer and Ordinary People. And they're both the same film. They're about the dangers of feminism and how men make better mothers than women and men make better women than women, which is the crescendo of that if you've seen Tootsie, Dustin Hoffman in Tootsie. I'll get to that in a minute. Contrast that with what's going on the MTM show, where there's an ensemble in which women play a central role, but not a dominant role. And so if you read feminist theory and try to think about what's the audiovisual representation of feminism in the popular terrain, it's certainly not in the cinema, but it is in television. So just think about the tone of Annie Hall and the tone of the films that I'm about to show you from the so-called new male melodrama of the late 70s and the early 80s as compared with this.
Mary, have you heard from DeFalco yet?
No, Mr. Grant, I'll let you know as soon as he calls.
But the station manager giving you a hard time about the Falco again, Lou?
Yeah. And it seemed like such a terrific idea. Remember, Mary, I said, have a cameraman ride around in the back of a patrol car to film an on-the-spot arrest. And you said the idea was
Wonderful.
I wouldn't be in this mess now if you had said rock. You know that? No, you had to say wonderful.
Same here. You'll never guess what I saw going on down the hall. Come on, you want to guess?
No, Ted, not right now.
Oh, come on. It'll be fun. I'll give you 20 questions.
Yeah, I'm really kind of busy.
How about you, Murray? Two can play this game. Hey, I'll bet that's where the expression came from. Not now, Ted. All right, I'll give you a hint. It's animal, and it concerns Sue Ann Nibbins, the happy homemaker.
Ted, what did you say about Sue Ann Nibbins?
Said it's animal, and it concerns Sue Ann Nibbins, the happy homemaker. You got 19 questions left.
Ted, what did you say about Sue Ann Nibbins?
Well, I saw the guy that Sue Ann Nibbins has been playing around with. Saw him coming out of the dressing room. Funny thing is, I know him from somewhere, but I can't remember where. Say, Murr, maybe you can remember. He's a tall, blonde-haired
Ted,
fella.
are you sure that they're playing around?
Of course. It's all over the building. But you know what really teased me off? Sue Ann Nibbins. Right under my very nose, all this time, hot to trot, and I don't do anything about it. I don't remember who that guy was.
It's impossible. Patrol car that hasn't made an arrest in...
Hey, Lou, if you want some real action, send him over to the happy homemaker's dressing room. Gee, if I can only remember who that guy was.
How can it not work? I know it's going to work. Mary, tell me it's going to work.
It is going to work, Mr. Grant. It's a wonderful idea.
See? You did it again, Mary. I gave you another chance to say rotten, but you said wonder. You're in this up to here.
Okay, so just track the way in which the set is used. So what you need to know is that I Love Lucy, Honeymooners, All in the Family are built around what the Herb Zettel multi-camera aesthetics textbooks calls a flat set, an x-axis set. So imagine Archie's seat. There's the camera, there's Archie sitting in his chair, and right behind him is the stairs. So the x-axis is the width of the image, and the z-axis is the depth of the image. What MTM is about to invent is a deep z-axis set. The crowning achievement of which is the bar in Cheers. We never see the bar in this kind of x-axis orientation. We always see in the z-axis orientation where we look down the depth of the bar as a kind of vanishing point. And that means that MTM is inventing a complex visual style that looks like a film set. And multi-camera television does not naturally come to that because it's drawn out of the stage. And so the Honeymooners may as well be shot on a radio soundstage, that it has no depth, on radio, you didn't need any depth. And so there's no transition from the radio sitcom to the television sitcom. And even as late as this, you're just getting the inklings of what one could do with a more complicated set. So Mary is the point in which the family is drawn, both at her apartment when Rhoda and Phyllis come up to visit. Imagine Seinfeld. You can't have Seinfeld without the Mary Tyler Moore Show. It looks like a domestic family sitcom. So think about every X-axis domestic family sitcom. Cosby Show, Roseanne, All in the Family. The kitchen's to the left, and we mostly sit in the living room. Mr. Grant's office is the equivalent of the kitchen, and he disappears into it. And then immediately, whatever that vacates is a new drama that comes right behind it. In this case, Ted coming from the newsroom, from the studio over. And then notice that it's not an axial narrative. It's called the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but this image where Mary goes off to do something like Mr. Grant just went off to do something, is not seen in All in the Family, in Bewitched, in I Love Lucy. I Love Lucy without Lucy is impossible to imagine. And yet, for some swath of time, Mary is fully replaced by Ted Knight. Notice that they're using the set in ways that generally aren't used in something like The Honeymooners. And you get these pairings of two people that produce the drama. Mary's worried that her friend's being cheated on. And then the weird angle between the desk and the dramatic axis, what's supposed to be perpendicular to the camera, is a metaphor for the transition that's occurring in television. This is a shot in depth when Mr. Grant returns that you never see in All in the Family, I Love Lucy. None of the axial sitcoms work with this kind of depth. And then of course, by the time you get to Cheers, it's no longer even an angle. The bar is essentially a diamond that goes very deep. So Sam's office in Cheers is way in back of the bar. And you see this kind of configuration all the time in that show because of the way the set's designed. Okay, so the logic here is that the shift from axial to workplace family narratives is opening up a more communal sense of narrative. It displaces central patriarchal power, and it produces a space for women to talk to each other on television. So there are small examples of that earlier. So Ethel comes over to talk to Lucy all the time. But the sense that you could have a narrative that's about a central female protagonist who's connected to other women is incredibly radical in the 1970s. So if you know the Bechdel test, Alison Bechdel, creative writer, graphic novelist, invented this website. And the game of the website is that you think about the movie and who talks to each other. And a film passes the Bechdel test if two women talk to each other without talking about a guy. And like 6% of the movies that Hollywood releases pass the Bechdel test. And it's of tremendous significance that the sitcom is far more ideologically advanced than the cinema of the same period. And so I'll just make that maneuver, and then that might be enough for today. So this critic for American Film Magazine, Dave Kerr, wrote this beautiful essay called The New Male Melodrama, and he analyzes 3 films, Kramer versus Kramer, Ordinary People, and Tootsie. And he makes the same argument that Susan Faludi makes in her book Backlash. Faludi looks at the neoconservative revolution of the 1980s and says, whatever ground was gained by the women's movement in the 1970s has been dismantled. And one manifestation of that is the cinema. That whatever mild feminism Annie Hall presented is not only erased, but drawn backwards. And so Kramer versus Kramer is about how a guy learns to be a better mother to his son than his wife was. That's the exact same plot of Ordinary People. And in fact, the films are made sequentially and both win the Best Picture Oscar. And the cultural logic of this is that it makes perfect sense for these kinds of conservative films to win Best Picture at the moment when Jimmy Carter is being displaced by Ronald Reagan and the neoconservative revolution. The crowning achievement, such as it is, of that line of reasoning is not only do men make better mothers than women, men make better women than women. And if you just want one image analysis of the neoconservative backlash against feminism, this moment from Tootsie is the one that film scholars usually roll out. So Tootsie's 1983. And Dustin Hoffman is playing a struggling actor, and he can't get a role because he's a guy, but he discovers when he dresses up like a woman, he gets a role on a soap opera. So there cannot be a more precise analog to the argument going out in the social space, which is what affirmative action has done in the 1970s is take power away from white men. And so white men are being reverse discriminated against. And so that's literally what this is about. Dustin Hoffman is better off as a woman. And at this moment, he's helping his friend Terry Garr get a role, and then watch the way he has to train her to be angry as a woman, which is, I think, at some fundamental level, the strangest thing to happen in a Hollywood movie. If you live in New York City in 1983 as a single woman, you probably know how to get angry. And yet the preposterous presumption of this film is that Dustin Hoffman has to teach her.
I did have a good time. I really did, Mike. Yes, I did. You're wrong, Dr. Brewster. I'm very proud of being a woman.
All right, Sandy, wait a minute now. This guy treats you like dirt because you're a woman and he's a big doctor, right? But you don't have to take that. You can talk to him on his level.
Show me what you mean.
You're wrong, Doctor. What are you doing, a Southern accent? You're wrong, Dr. Brewster. I'm very proud of being a woman.
See, I can't do it as good as you.
Yes, you can. Just turn the tables on him. Come on now, will you?
You're wrong, Dr. Brewster. I'm very proud of being a woman. Where am I off?
I don't know what you're playing.
Well, I'm playing rage. I'm enraged. You told me to turn the tables on him, and I'm playing rage.
This is rage?
I have a problem with anger.
Yeah, you certainly do. But I'll tell you something, there's 100 other actresses meeting for this part who don't have a problem with anger, who aren't afraid of working, who aren't afraid to stick everything out on the line and do it.
Well, don't get mad at me.
Well, stop being a doormat then.
I'm not a doormat.
Act right now. Do it.
You're wrong, Dr. Brewster.
Go on.
You're wrong, Dr. Brewster.
What do I have to do? Hit you with a stick?
You're wrong, Dr. Brewster. I am very proud to be a woman, and I'm proud of this hospital. And before I see it destroyed by your petty tyrannies,
Have the anger. Don't show it to me. Don't
I'll
push.
recommend to the board that you be thrown out into the street.
Don't lose it now.
Good day, Dr. Brewster.
Don't whine like you're a second-rate
I
actress.
said good day.
Not bad, pretty good.
Did you feel how much I hated you?
Yeah,
Did you really? You felt it? Oh,
yeah, that's why I'm.
Now, wait a minute, where are you going? How am I going to get it back tomorrow? How am I going to get a total stranger to enrage me?
All right, I'll pick you up at 10 o'clock and enrage you.
So that probably gets us to the stuff that I sent you for this week. So because I'm a literature and film person, I'm interested in literary culture. So it dawned on me that one way of approaching this similar material, the shift from some kind of nebulous patriarchal culture at the roots of American history through the women's liberation movement into the backlash, is to think about the relationship between somebody like John Updike. And so I had you read his story A&P from the early 70s, told specifically from this young man's point of view. Three girls, big, tall, goony, enter the store. And he imagines this grandiose gesture of standing up to his boss, and he gets fired because of it. And that's what American fiction in the New Yorker looks like in the early 1970s. And then the wave of second wave feminism produces a very different set of female authors, Margaret Atwood probably being the most famous of them. And The Handmaid's Tale has only become more and more pertinent, particularly with the doubling down of the neoconservative revolution into whatever Trumpism is. So it's useful to pair Updike's story against feminist fiction. So Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber is, along with Jeanette Winterston and a whole bunch of 80s authors, turning traditional stories about men and women on their ear. The Bloody Chamber tends to work with my students because they know the fairy tales that Carter is reforming into feminist narrative. And then it works as a film scholar to do this because Neil Jordan, Irish filmmaker who made The Crying Game, makes an adaptation of one of the stories in Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber in the Company of Wolves. So that's one maneuver that I make. And then another maneuver is to end the story of the sitcom. So a show like Sex and the City takes what Mary Tyler Moore did, renders it slightly axial because Carrie is the character around which the rest of the show orbits. But attempts to rewrite the history of audiovisual narrative in the United States. The most important way Sex and the City does that is Carrie's relationship with Mr. Big crescendos with the ending of The Way We Were, which is a complicated story, right? So Sex and the City is about life in New York City in the 90s. And Carrie's breakup with Mr. Big happens on the streets of New York, which is a reference to an early 70s film, Robert Redford and Barbara Streisand breakup, which itself is a story about the 1950s. The reason that Redford and Streisand break up is that she becomes a radical in the 60s and he returns to his patrician roots. And I'm not sure I can talk without showing the end of The Way We Were. It's one of my favorite films that drives my wife crazy. So this is romantic comedy gone horribly wrong, that we know they're right for each other, but that's not what's going to happen. And so rather than one accepting the other's difference, the narrative ends with them split apart despite our desperate desire to have them reunite. So the breakup is far into the past, and they meet each other on the streets of New York by accident. And Hubble, the Robert Redford guy, is with his new girlfriend. So, note the way in which Annie Hall echoes a little bit of this, but The Way We Were is a more pointed political film. Because in the 1950s, they're fighting against McCarthyism, and by the early 1970s, she's maintained her radical position and he's retreated into the power structure.
How we doing, huh? Oh, wonderful. We got 122 on that one. Yeah, and Charlene called from downtown.
Yeah.
She's doing just great.
Marvelous.
Wonderful. Oh, that's a good one, too.
Yeah.
don't you think?
What about Eileen?
You never give up, do you?
Only when I'm absolutely forced to. Very good loser.
Better than I.
The girl is lovely, Hubble. Why don't you bring her for a drink when you come?
I can't.
She is just beautiful. You would be so proud of her.
I'm glad.
Is he a good father?
Yes. Very.
Good.
Secret.
See ya.
Dance on! Join the thousands of Americans who are protesting the use and manufacture of K-pop. Write your congressman today.
May be beautiful and yet what's too painful to remember, we simply choose to forget.
sometimes I'll come home, be watching the ending of The Way We Were dozens of times, and my wife will be like, not again. If I really want to annoy her, I call her Hubble and start singing The Way We Were. This is the sacred text to which Sex and the City refers. And this is the central plot line of this long-term 10-year sitcom narrative. And this is the big crescendo of Sex and the City.
What's that?
I had a choice. I could run, or I could stand and ask him the question that if I didn't ask, would haunt me the rest of my life.
I thought by the time I got here, I'd know what to say.
And
Well, you're late. Party's over.
I'll say it is.
Funny.
Anyway, I was just on my way home. Hey, I have a question for you. Why wasn't it me?
Carrie.
No, seriously. I really need to hear you say it. Come on, be a friend.
I don't know. It just got so hard. And she's...
The girl is lovely, Heather.
I don't get it.
And you never did.
Girl, easy.
Then I had a thought. Maybe I didn't break big. Maybe the problem was he couldn't break me. Maybe some women aren't meant to be tamed. Maybe they need to run free until they find someone just as wild to run with.
I love it if for no other reason than never trust anyone that doesn't know who Hubble is. Okay. So let me build a little crescendo here. So parallel to the neoconservative backlash in the United States in the early 80s is feminist art cinema. I want to show you the end of the Dutch film by Marlene Goerens called A Question of Silence. And what's happening in the film is this psychiatrist has been asked to interview these three women who are of three different class positions. There's a rich woman, there's a secretary at a bank, and there's a working class barmaid. And for reasons that none of the men in the film can understand, they go into a boutique and they murder brutally the shopkeeper. So they're in prison and they hire the central character to be the psychiatrist to try to understand their behavior. And by the end of the film, she's come to understand exactly why they did it. And the reasons are demonstrated by the film, that she herself who refuses to indict the murderers as insane, is herself attacked by the judicial system. And you'll see the moment that initiates the insane ending is when the judge and the lawyer insists that what happened in the shop would have been exactly the same had 3 men killed a woman. And the women who are on trial begin laughing, and then you'll see the way in which these characters bond together as the film ends.
Zolang u dat niet wilt onderkennen. Bedoelt u dat ze iets hadden tegen een man die toevallig ook beroepshalve kleren verkocht? Maar dat zijn er zoveel. Precies. Begrijpt u nou niet dat die man... Moet u horen, mevrouw Van der Bos. Ik weet werkelijk niet waar u op aanstuurt. Ik zie absoluut geen verschil tussen dit geval en, laten we zeggen, als ze de vrouwelijke eigenaar van een klerenzaak hadden vermoord. Of andersom, als ze, zeg maar, als 3 mannen een eigenaresse van een boutique hadden vermoord. Rechtbank.
And so their laughter contaminates even the psychiatrist. So there's a famous essay in feminist theory by Helene Cixous called The Laugh of the Medusa. And what I'm suggesting is that this essay is being imploded in a movie. So Cixous and Luce Irigaray are these new French feminist psychoanalysts of the late 70s. And what Cixous argues in this essay is that you have these patriarchal constructions of women, in this case, the Medusa, who were asked to see as monstrous. And what she does is try to reclaim the Medusa. If you're constructed in that absurd way as monstrous, what's the appropriate response? And her theorization is laughter. Laughter of the insane, traditionally associated with the hysterical, which is a way that psychoanalysis from the very start positioned women. What's wrong with middle-class women? They're hysterical. This is why women's uteri were taken out. A hysterectomy has the same root. So Cixous is playing around with this history of psychoanalysis and this mythology about the monstrous woman. And that is essentially what's imploded by Goris's A Question of Silence. So there's these 2 parallel channels. In the international art cinema, there's this radical feminist film that's essentially using radical feminist theory. And there's Tootsie in the Hollywood cinema. And so I'll just pause there and ask, did my gambit work to have you watch Birth, which is another way in which I might position what happens to the art cinema subsequent to the 1980s. Oh, wait, yeah, you're gonna watch Birth next week. So Sally Potter's Orlando and Birth are both art cinema. Sally Potter is a British filmmaker, made experimental shorts in the 1970s. In the 1970s feminist film lecture, I show her film Thriller, which is a deconstruction of Puccini's La Boheme. Potter would go on to have this career, worked with Tilda Swinton, who's now an incredibly important movie star. Orlando's an adaptation of a Virginia Woolf novel about trans identity. But that international art cinema begins to inflect even American independent cinema. So Jonathan Glazer, who's a music video filmmaker at the start, makes a set of really beautiful, puzzling films. For this class, the one that pertains the most is Birth. Nicole Kidman plays a socialite whose husband dies, and for no apparent reason, this little boy claims to be her husband reincarnated. So when you have a look at Birth, just think about the ways in which these two strains, American cinema and the international art cinema, begin to collapse as we enter into the present moment, and what that might mean for the history of feminism. So my wife told me not to keep you late. I did last time. So for next week, we'll come to the crescendo of the class. I'll talk to you about the article I wrote about Easy A, which is a high school film about the Scarlet Letter. I'll talk about female artists represented in cinema. I'm most interested in Steven Shainberg's film Fur, which is a biography of Diane Arbus, the 1960s photographer played by Nicole Kidman. Legally Blonde, about the nature of women entering into professions, in this case, law. And then when I taught the class to the undergraduates the first time, the Ghostbusters with Melissa McCarthy was about to be released. So I did a lecture on the sexist nature of the original Ghostbusters film from 1984. Essentially, the academic party line on the original Ghostbusters is that it's the birth of the kind of idiot teen boy comedies that we have, Seth Rogen being, I think, the most important contemporary articulation, where you watch the films and you're like, why are these beautiful women going out with these idiot boy childs? The movie with Seth Rogen where he gets Katherine Heigl pregnant. It's just hard to fathom how many somersaults you need to do to figure out how pothead Seth Rogen is going to be in the same orbit as Katherine Heigl. And partly the roots of that are in Bill Murray, who exists as a kind of id that exists outside the social structure. So his role in these movies like Stripes and Ghostbusters is to protect the little boy in the man. And that really has tremendous influence over the subsequent history of Hollywood comedy. So I was really excited to see what a female Ghostbusters would look like. And I think it's a brilliant film. I am shocked at having gone to the theater. I saw it 14 days in a row. And I looked around and people didn't seem to be as profoundly affected by it as I was. So I've subsequently written about it and built a lecture so I can end the class with that. It begs the question, what kind of movies in 2021 should we be thinking about and writing about? But that was where I left the class the last time I thought about such matters. All right. Thoughts, questions? That's all I know about
No, I'm-
feminism for today. Yep, go ahead.
Yep. I know I'm gonna miss next week's class. I'll be on a flight.
Uh-huh.
How can I get recordings of this class?
Oh, I don't know. Someone's recording it, but not me. Do we know where the recordings are going? I don't know.
I had that same question because
right.
I've noticed that things have been taking another class too, and they're recording. I'm going, okay, where do?
Yeah, it's not me. Send an email to Roland person, and we can find out. If anyone would know, he would know.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I send you the links to the lectures. They're all video lecture captured. So you'll be able to see the lecture captures. Essentially 20-minute expansions of what I'm doing in a couple minutes with y'all. Yeah, so next Wednesday, the end of this, and then the Monday after that, the comedy class starts. And apparently we'll be able to sit in a room together at the Lutheran church. We'll see if that turns out to be the case. I'm not holding my breath, but that would be wonderful. Okay, I hope you have a nice week. I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Walter.
Bye-bye.